If you press your palm flat against the wall of a corridor 80 meters beneath central Turkey, the stone is cool, perhaps 13 degrees, year-round, unchanging. The surface of the tuff is smooth, where thousands of hands have steadied themselves in the dark across centuries, and faintly rough where the original pick marks remain, each shallow groove the record of a single stroke from a tool held by someone whose name was never written down. The corridor is narrow, barely wide enough for one person. The air moves, gently but perceptibly, drawn through passages you cannot see by temperature differentials between the earth and the sky above. If you stand still long enough, you can feel it on the back of your hand, a current so faint it might be imagined, except that it has sustained breathable atmosphere across dozens of interconnected levels for longer than most nations have existed. There is no sound from the surface. There is no light that has not been carried down by human hands, and yet this place was home, temporarily, repeatedly, for perhaps 3,000 years, to communities who descended into the earth to wait out the passage of danger overhead. A groove cut into the stone floor, about the width of a human hand, curves along this corridor. Seated within it rests a disk of volcanic rock weighing roughly 500 kilograms. One person, standing behind it in near total darkness, can roll it shut. The door locks from the inside. There is no mechanism to open it from the other side. Through its centre runs a small aperture, not a handle, but an opening through which a spear can be thrust into the passage beyond. The corridor itself forces every approaching figure into a bent single-file posture, arms pressed to the walls. Anyone who passes the spear emerges one at a time into a chamber where defenders stand at full height. This is not reconstruction. This is not inference from ambiguous evidence. This is the physical reality, still intact, still measurable, still cold to the touch, of an underground city carved 85 meters into the bedrock beneath a quiet town called Derinkuyu. A city with more than 600 concealed entrances, many hidden within private homes on the surface. A city whose individual floors can be sealed off independently from below, whose water supply is controlled by the deepest inhabitants, so that anyone capturing upper levels cannot contaminate it. A city where an army could pass directly over the heads of thousands of sheltering people and never know they were there. The question that shapes everything that follows is a quiet one. How did ordinary agricultural communities, without centralized state power, without professional engineers, without written plans, build and sustain the most sophisticated underground refuge network in human history, and do it across 100 generations? The answer is not a single revelation. It is a convergence. Geology that cooperated, climate that threatened, invaders that kept coming, and a social fabric durable enough to transmit practical knowledge across nearly 3,000 years. Every element of that convergence left its evidence in the stone. Cappadocia occupies an open Anatolian plateau that is, from a defensive perspective, remarkably exposed. No mountain ranges form natural barriers, no major rivers create defensible boundaries. No choke points exist where a small garrison might hold against a superior force. The landscape rolls outward in every direction, broad and undulating, offering an austere beauty that conceals its strategic emptiness. For the farming communities of central Anatolia, populations trying to survive between the ambitions of empires, not professional armies, this geography offered a singular reality. Visibility meant vulnerability. Walls could be built, of course, and were. But walls require quarried stone, transportation, construction labour, and decades of maintenance. They can be besieged, undermined, scaled, and broken. The history of Anatolian surface fortification is largely a history of eventual breach. Every wall built on the plateau was eventually overcome, its stones repurposed by the next occupying force. The pattern taught a lesson that the communities of Cappadocia absorbed over centuries. What could be seen could be found, and what could be found could be taken. What the plateau lacked in topographic defence, however, it compensated for beneath the surface. Between roughly 10 and 15 million years ago, during the Miocene and Pliocene epochs, eruptions from Mount Erciyes, Hasandagi, and the Melendez volcanic chain deposited hundreds of meters of pyroclastic material across approximately 5,000 square kilometers. The eruptions were not single events, but recurring cycles spanning millions of years, each depositing new layers of volcanic ash, pumice, and fragmented rock over the cooling remnants of previous eruptions. Over geological time, these stratified deposits consolidated through compaction and mineral cementation into a formation known as tuff, a pale, fine-grained stone that ranges in colour from cream to warm ochre, depending on its mineral composition, and that feels, when freshly cut, almost like dense chalk beneath the fingers. The layered nature of this deposition produced a stone whose properties vary subtly with depth and location, a variability that ancient carvers would eventually learn to read with remarkable precision. Cappadocian tuff possesses a quality that seems almost designed for human use. When freshly exposed, it is soft enough to carve with simple iron picks, even with stone tools in certain compositions. Upon prolonged exposure to air, it undergoes drying and chemical transformation, including zeolite cementation and pozzolanic reactions, that significantly increases its hardness and structural integrity. The rock cures. What you carve soft, you inhabit hard. This single geological fact made underground excavation radically cheaper and faster than surface construction. A lone worker with an iron pick could carve functional space in freshly exposed tuff within hours, and the excavated material was not waste. Vladimir Neuvelt and colleagues, publishing in Procedure Engineering in 2016, explicitly described Derinkuyu as a specific building-urban concept tied to the extraction of tough rock building materials. The stone removed from underground was carried to the surface and used for construction above. The often dramatized mystery of where the excavated rock went has a straightforward answer, made less remarkable still when distributed across more than 2,000 years of incremental work. But soft carvable rock is only useful underground if it remains standing once hollowed out. Omer Aden of the University of the Ryukyus and Rasat Ulusay of Hacettepe University conducted the most comprehensive geomechanical evaluation of Derinkuyu ever published, appearing in Rock Mechanics and Rock Engineering in 2013. Their study, involving observational, experimental and theoretical analyses conducted from 1996 onward, confirmed that Cappadocian tuff is self-supporting. It requires no reinforcement. Arched ceilings and barrel vaults distribute load efficiently across the rock mass. Large support pillars bear compressive loads at critical junctures, and the stable underground environment eliminates the thermal cycling that degrades surface structures through repeated expansion and contraction. The researchers installed acoustic emission and electrical potential monitoring systems at the 5th and 7th floors, and their findings demonstrated remarkable stability. Chambers carved over 2 millennia ago remain intact. A 2022 finite element analysis published in the Journal of Mountain Science confirmed this structural resilience even under worst-case seismic scenarios. Yet the picture carries a necessary qualification. Topol and Doyuran, publishing in Engineering Geology in 1997, rated the durability of Cappadocian tuff against long-term weathering as poor to very poor. Water infiltration poses the single greatest threat, capable of reducing structural strength by approximately 50%. The same porosity that made the rock easy to carve makes it vulnerable to moisture. The city has survived for millennia precisely because its underground location shields it from most surface weathering processes, but where water penetrates, from modern plumbing, drainage, or shifting water tables, deterioration accelerates. Only an estimated 10% of the complex is currently accessible to tourists. Perhaps 50% has been partially surveyed by archaeologists. The remainder lies beneath the modern town, its extent unknown, its condition unassessed. The geology also explains why underground cities cluster in specific areas rather than appearing uniformly across the tuff formation. Though Cappadocian tuff is present throughout a 5,000 square kilometre region, defensive underground construction concentrates where additional factors align. Water table depth shallow enough for well access, but deep enough to permit extensive excavation, surface topography that conceals ventilation shaft openings, proximity to agricultural land, and strategic location relative to known corridors through the Cilician Gates and adjacent mountain passes. The tuff itself varies in composition and hardness across the region, and not all deposits possess the ideal combination of initial softness and post-exposure hardening. Site selection reflected sophisticated geological awareness, accumulated through generations of practical interaction with the stone, knowledge transmitted through the same empirical channels as the structural expertise visible in pillar placement and ceiling thickness. The discovery of Assyrian tin mines in Kayseri province by the Obruk Cave Research Group suggests that the region's underground excavation tradition may have origins predating defensive construction by centuries. Mining requires precisely the skills that underground city building demands: the ability to assess rock stability, manage ventilation in enclosed spaces, organize labor for material removal, and maintain structural integrity across expanding volumes. If commercial mining provided the technical foundation on which defensive architecture was later built, then Derinkuyu's origins may involve an economic dimension not fully appreciated in current scholarship. The progression from mining tunnels to storage chambers to defensive refuges to integrated underground cities represents a plausible developmental sequence, one that reframes these cities not as sudden responses to crisis, but as the ultimate expression of a deep regional tradition of subterranean work. Carving space underground is only half the challenge. The other half is breathing in it. 52 major ventilation chimneys, documented by Ergovanli and User in their 1977 publication on underground openings in volcanic tuffs, range from 70 to 85 metres in length. These primary shafts are supplemented by thousands of smaller boreholes, approximately 10 centimetres in diameter, creating what Nivelt and colleagues described as a self-propelled air conditioning system. More recent acoustic research by Sezin Nas of Istanbul Galata University estimated the number of smaller air passages at over 50,000, a discrepancy from earlier counts that likely reflects different classification thresholds between primary shafts, secondary chimneys, and minor passages rather than contradictory findings. The operating principle exploits what engineers call the stack effect. The temperature underground remains constant at approximately 13 degrees Celsius year-round. The differential between the stable subterranean temperature and the variable surface temperature, which in Cappadocia swings between summer highs above 35 degrees and winter lows well below freezing, generates natural convective airflow through the multi-shaft system. Warm air rises through certain passages while cooler air descends through others, creating continuous circulation without any mechanical input. The system is entirely passive. It runs on physics. During summer months, when surface temperatures climb highest, the differential is greatest and the airflow most vigorous, coinciding with the season when Arab raids historically made underground refuge most necessary. Whether this seasonal alignment was recognized and intentionally exploited by the builders, or simply a fortunate consequence of thermodynamics, the practical result was that the ventilation system performed best precisely when the population needed it most. The stack effect was not formally described in thermodynamic terms until the 19th century. The Cappadocian builders were exploiting it 2,000 years earlier, not through theoretical understanding, but through accumulated observation of what worked. The largest ventilation shaft, extending over 55 metres deep, served simultaneously as the primary water well, a characteristic integration of function that appears throughout Derinkuyu's design. The water system was deliberately structured so that lower floors controlled access, preventing anyone who sees surface levels from contaminating the supply. Multiple independent wells served different sections, ensuring that damage to one did not compromise the entire network. NASA's research has also begun revealing a dimension of this infrastructure that conventional archaeology has largely overlooked. Using interdisciplinary methods combining archaeology, architectural history, and acoustical science, she reconstructed the ancient soundscape of Derinkuyu, focusing on 3 primary space types: a church, a living area, and a kitchen. Her findings suggest that the ventilation shafts and tunnel network created a complex acoustic ecology. Sound carried through enclosed rock tunnels in patterns fundamentally different from surface environments, creating acoustic zones that may have defined social boundaries, facilitated communication across disparate areas, and enabled warning systems during active threats. The barrel-vaulted church spaces produced reverberant acoustics with long decay times, enhancing chanting and communal prayer in ways that may have served as sonic anchors for community identity during the disorienting experience of extended underground habitation. These findings open an investigative avenue barely explored: how ancient underground communities organized themselves and maintained social cohesion through sound. To appreciate the full achievement at Derinkuyu, consider the construction process itself, a process spanning centuries that required solving problems with no surface world equivalent. Imagine the work of excavating a single room at the 5th level, approximately 40 metres below the surface. The carver begins at a point already connected to the existing tunnel network, chipping into virgin tuff with an iron pick. The freshly exposed rock is soft, almost chalky, yielding to each strike with minimal resistance. This softness is both advantage and danger. Rapid progress means increased risk of removing too much supporting material. The carver must intuitively understand load distribution, where to leave pillars, how thick to keep ceilings, how to read the subtle variations in the stone that signal where strength lies and where it does not. There are no blueprints. No engineering drawings have been found for any Cappadocian underground city. No mathematical calculations for pillar spacing or ceiling thickness have been recovered. The knowledge was almost certainly empirical, passed from experienced carvers to apprentices across generations, encoded not in documents, but in practice, in the feel of the pick striking tough that was ready to give versus tough that needed to stay. This form of knowledge transmission, tactile, experiential, communicated through demonstration rather than instruction, has parallels in craft traditions worldwide, from Japanese temple carpentry to West African bronze casting, where the most critical technical judgments cannot be reduced to written formulae, but must be absorbed through years of guided practice. A wrong decision, a pillar too narrow, a ceiling too thin could produce collapse. The fact that no floor at Derinkuyu has ever collapsed represents the accumulated safety record of thousands of individual decisions made over millennia, every one of them correct. This record implies not only individual competence, but an extraordinarily reliable system of knowledge transmission, one that maintained standards across centuries without the stabilizing framework of written documentation. The logistical demands were immense. Excavated material had to be removed through the existing tunnel network, carried or hauled up narrow passages and staircases to the surface. A single cubic metre of tuff weighs approximately 1,500 kilograms. Even a modest room of 3 by 4 metres with a 2-metre ceiling requires removing approximately 36 metric tons of material. At the 5th level, that material must traverse 40 metres of vertical distance through passages designed for human transit, not materials handling. The labour of removal dwarfed the labour of carving. Though spread across generations, the daily effort need not have been extraordinary. Ventilation had to be extended as construction progressed deeper, maintaining breathable atmosphere in working areas sealed from the surface by metres of rock. This required either extending existing shafts downward through occupied living spaces above, or creating new vertical passages from the surface, maintaining precise alignment across tens of metres, using nothing more sophisticated than plumb lines and careful measurement. The 52 major shafts, some exceeding 80 metres, are not rough holes punched through rock. They are engineered conduits, sized and positioned to sustain the differential airflow patterns described earlier. The water system reveals equivalent sophistication. The primary well shaft extends over 55 metres, penetrating through multiple occupied levels to reach the water table. This shaft was either carved through the existing city structure, or more likely the city was carved around an existing water source, with subsequent construction designed to maintain both structural integrity around it and controlled access from different levels. The rolling stone doors required yet another domain of practical expertise. Each door is a disc of volcanic rock, roughly circular, weighing between 400 and 500 kilograms, heavy enough that its inertia alone constitutes a barrier, yet shaped and seated precisely enough that a single person can move it along its groove with a steady push. The groove must accommodate the door's exact diameter. The door must be circular enough to roll smoothly but fitted tightly enough to seal the passage. The pivot point must allow 1 or 2 people on the defensive side to operate it while it remains immovable from the other side, where the corridor's narrowness denies any attacker the leverage or purchase to push back. Each of these challenges was solved independently at different points in the city's construction history, and the solutions were retained, refined, and replicated as the complex expanded. This cumulative technological inheritance may be the most significant aspect of Derinkuyu's engineering. No single generation needed to solve all problems at once. Each generation inherited a functioning system and added to it incrementally, benefiting from proven solutions while contributing innovations of their own. The city is not a monument built in a burst of ambition. It is a palimpsest of practical intelligence, layered across millennia. The labour organisation behind this process raises questions that the physical evidence can suggest but not definitively answer. Who decided when to expand? Who coordinated the work? How was newly created space allocated? The more than 600 private entrances, each connecting a surface dwelling to the underground network, imply that individual families maintained control over their own underground access and the spaces immediately connected to it. Researchers have described the expansion as following largely organic processes, with property ownership and space allocation managed through mutual consent or divided among heirs. This suggests a decentralized model of development fundamentally different from the centralized, state-directed labour that produced most monumental construction in the ancient world. There was no pharaoh commanding thousands. The city grew through countless individual decisions, each family extending its own underground space in coordination with neighbours, the cumulative result being extraordinary complexity that emerged without central direction, a population capable of coordinating this expansion across generations, maintaining structural integrity, extending ventilation, managing shared water resources, and agreeing on defensive protocols, must have possessed robust mechanisms for collective decision-making. The archaeological evidence does not reveal whether authority resided in elected councils, hereditary leaders, religious figures, or some combination. But the physical structure itself is evidence of effective governance. Poorly coordinated expansion would have produced structural conflicts, chambers undermining adjacent chambers, ventilation shafts blocked by new construction, water channels disrupted by careless excavation. The absence of such failures implies coordination sophisticated enough to manage a three-dimensional urban environment, where every new room potentially affected the airflow, water access, and structural stability of dozens of existing spaces. The defensive features at Derinkuyu leave no ambiguity about the city's primary purpose. Wine presses, livestock stables, and churches could theoretically serve peaceful functions alone. Spear holes positioned above corridors cannot. Narrow passages engineered to force approaching figures into crouched single-file positions serve no domestic purpose. The ability to seal each floor independently from below creates a defense-in-depth system transposed into vertical space, with advantages no surface fortress could replicate. Consider the geometry facing an uninvited force. Entry requires passing through a corridor so narrow that two cannot advance abreast. The ceiling drops, forcing a bent posture. Weapons cannot be swung effectively. Blind corners cut at deliberate angles deny any forward line of sight. At intervals, the rolling stone doors, sealed from beyond, present half-ton barriers that cannot be gripped, leveraged or bypassed, each fitted with that small aperture through which defenders can strike without exposure. If one door is breached, another waits. Each floor seals independently. The defenders withdraw downward through a structure they know intimately, closing each barrier behind them, controlling water, maintaining breathable air, while any pursuing force presses deeper into unfamiliar stone passages where every advantage belongs to the people who carved them. Andrea De Giorgi, Associate Professor of Classical Studies at Florida State University, stated the strategic logic directly in a 2022 interview documented by the BBC. The succession of empires and their impact on the landscapes of Anatolia accounts for the recourse to underground shelters like Derinkuyu. It was during the 7th century Islamic raids, he noted, that these dwellings were utilised to the fullest. His assessment reflects the mainstream scholarly consensus, which treats Derinkuyu primarily as a civilian refuge system, developed in response to a persistent cycle of incursion across Anatolian history. The more than 600 concealed entrances, many integrated into the floors and walls of private surface homes, meant the transition from surface life to underground refuge could occur rapidly and without visible preparation. An approaching raiding party would find an apparently deserted village. Below it, a living city they could not see, could not access, and might not even suspect existed. The defensive logic is most clearly understood through a cost-benefit framework specific to the kind of asymmetric situation these communities faced. Conventional fortification on an open plateau demands massive investment in materials, labour and ongoing maintenance, and ultimately provides a fixed target for any sufficiently determined force. Underground refuge, by contrast, exploits self-supporting tuff to create nearly undetectable shelter at a fraction of the cost. The strategy did not aim to defeat invading armies. It aimed to make the effort of clearing the underground network exceed any plausible reward. A raiding force on a schedule of rapid incursion and withdrawal could not afford to spend days working through layered subterranean defences when easier targets lay elsewhere. The logic of Derinkuyu was not absolute impregnability, but sufficient difficulty that rational adversaries would choose not to try. Richard McGillivray Dawkins, the Cambridge linguist who conducted extensive fieldwork among the Greek-speaking communities of Cappadocia between 1909 and 1911, documented the underground cities in active use. His 1916 publication, Modern Greek in Asia Minor, captured practices continuous for at least 2 millennia. Dawkins recorded a specific event in 1909 when news of the violence at Adana prompted Greek-speaking residents to take refuge underground, demonstrating that the defensive function of these spaces remained active well into the modern era. He also documented a 14th century episode involving the Mongol armies of Timur. One of Timur's captains, sent to pursue inhabitants who had descended underground, was felled by an arrow shot through one of the door apertures. The system remained effective centuries after its design, against precisely the kind of threat it was built to address. The Byzantine historian Leo the Deacon, writing in the 10th century, described Cappadocians as troglodytes who went underground in holes, clefts and labyrinths. His tone carries the condescension of a Constantinople writer describing provincial populations, but his observation confirms that underground habitation was common knowledge in the Byzantine world. Even earlier, Xenophon's Anabasis, composed around 370 BCE, describes communities in eastern Anatolia whose houses were underground, with a mouth like that of a well, but spacious below. Though Xenophon may have been describing Armenian rather than Cappadocian settlements, the passage confirms that underground habitation was an established Anatolian practice by the 4th century BCE, a tradition stretching back centuries before his observation and forward millennia after it. The weight of evidence permits a probabilistic assessment of competing explanatory theories. Military defence, as primary driver, commands approximately 85 to 90% probability based on the architectural evidence. The rolling stone doors, spear holes, forced crouch corridors, independently sealable levels, and controlled water access serve no non-military purpose. Climate functions as a contributing factor rather than a primary driver. Drought and volcanic winter repeatedly created the political instability that made underground refuge necessary, but the defensive architecture itself addresses military threat, not weather. It is plausible that the earliest use of excavated spaces for temperature-stable food storage was climate-motivated, providing the foundation that later civilizations expanded for military purposes. Underground temperatures of 13 degrees offer significant advantages for food preservation in a region with extreme seasonal variation. Disease and pandemic as primary motivation finds minimal support. The Narlake pollen record shows no agricultural decline during the plague of Justinian in 541 CE, and confining thousands of people with livestock in enclosed spaces would accelerate disease transmission rather than prevent it. The formal concept of quarantine did not exist until Dubrovnik established such practices in 1377. Religious and cultural motivations are documented but clearly secondary. The Christian features represent a later overlay on existing defensive infrastructure, with the earliest Christian physical remains in Cappadocia, dating to approximately the 6th century CE, well after the city's probable founding. No single catastrophe drove the construction of Derinkuyu. Instead, the city's expansion maps onto a pattern of recurring climate-driven political instability that made the plateau perilous for unprotected communities across 3 millennia. The earliest plausible construction phase coincides with the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, one of the most severe systemic failures in ancient history. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated Anatolia for centuries and maintained diplomatic correspondence with Egypt, Babylon and Assyria, as a peer among the great powers, entered terminal crisis through a convergence of factors scholars continue to debate. The collapse was not confined to Anatolia. It swept across the entire eastern Mediterranean, toppling palace economies from Mycenae to Ugarit, severing trade networks that had linked civilizations from the Aegean to Mesopotamia, and inaugurating a period of disruption so thorough that some regions would not recover comparable levels of urban complexity for centuries. Cities that had exchanged ambassadors and traded in copper, tin and textiles fell silent within a generation. The administrative records stop, the pottery changes, the monumental building ceases. Eric Klein of George Washington University characterized it as a combination of drought, famine, disease, invaders and earthquakes. but a 2022 study published in Nature by Sturt Manning and colleagues at Cornell brought critical precision. Manning's team analysed tree ring widths and stable carbon isotope records from contemporary juniper trees preserved in the Midas Mound tumulus at Gordion, producing a high-resolution dryness record for central Anatolia, spanning approximately 1500 to 800 BCE. The data revealed that the region had experienced periodic drought throughout this period, with societies generally adapting successfully. What distinguished the 1198 to 1196 BCE event was not severity alone, but duration. 3 consecutive years of extreme dryness, pushing agricultural systems beyond their documented resilience capacity. Manning articulated the implications with care. If you're running a government in these areas, you expect occasional droughts and plan for them. But you do not expect or plan for year after year of drought. 3 consecutive years created cascading failures, undermining the Hittite tax base, army provisioning, and social stability simultaneously. The capital of Hattusa was burned and abandoned, its great walls left standing over empty courtyards. Karaoglan, near present-day Ankara, was burned and its dead left unburied, a detail that speaks to the speed and totality of the collapse, since proper burial was among the most fundamental obligations in Hittite culture. Many Anatolian sites show destruction layers from this period, a band of ash and rubble visible in excavation profiles that marks the boundary between one world and the next. Into the resulting power vacuum moved new populations, including the Phrygians, whose arrival through the Bosporus or over the Caucasus brought new pressures to an already devastated landscape. For communities familiar with basic underground refuge, perhaps already using natural caves or simple excavations for storage, the collapse of the Hittite imperial system would have provided powerful motivation to expand and formalize underground construction. Without the empire's military infrastructure to provide security, local populations needed their own means of protection. The geological opportunity of the tuff, combined with the defensive necessity created by political collapse, may have catalyzed the transformation from simple underground storage to systematic underground habitation. A. Bertini, a specialist in Mediterranean cave architecture, argued that the Hittites may have excavated the first few levels when they came under pressure from the Phrygians around this period. A single Hittite tool recovered from inside the complex provides thin but suggestive material evidence for this early date. Though one tool is insufficient for definitive attribution, it could represent a spoil carried later by subsequent inhabitants. Toolmark analysis does reveal older sections carved with stone implements, beneath newer sections carved with metal tools, pushing the probable origin back further than the Phrygian period that Turkish authorities officially attribute to the first galleries. The Phrygians brought to the task a cultural and technical disposition uniquely suited to underground architecture. Centred on the capital of Gordion in western central Anatolia, Phrygian civilization produced some of the ancient world's most impressive rock-cut monuments. The Midas city complex near Eskişehir features facades carved directly into cliff faces, some reaching 17 metres in height, decorated with intricate geometric patterns and inscriptions that remain legible today, their edges still precise after nearly 3 millennia of weathering. De Giorgi described the Phrygians as having a talent for monumentalizing rock formations and creating remarkable rock-cut facades. This was not merely technical capability, it was cultural identity. The Phrygians understood rock not as an obstacle, but as a medium, a material to be shaped, inhabited, and made to express meaning. Where other cultures built upon the landscape, the Phrygians carved into it. Their approach to stone bore a kind of philosophical intimacy with the geological substrate itself, treating it as raw material not for construction atop the earth, but for architecture within it. The conceptual distance between carving monumental facades into cliff faces and carving habitable spaces into underground tuff formations is smaller than it might initially appear. Both require the same fundamental skill: reading the stone, understanding its structural properties, and removing material with precision while leaving integrity intact. Systematic comparison of toolmark patterns between Derinkuyu and known Phrygian rock-cut sites could strengthen or weaken this attribution, representing a significant and tractable research opportunity. The pattern of external pressure continued across centuries, with variations in the arriving force but consistency in the result. Persian expansion under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE conquered the Phrygian successor states and incorporated Cappadocia into the Achaemenid system. Roman administration followed. Early Christian communities during the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE used the underground spaces as refuges during imperial persecutions under Decius and Diocletian, adding religious infrastructure, churches, baptismal fonts, schools, to what had been secular defensive architecture. The Roman period introduced a dimension that transcended defence. As Christianity spread through the eastern Roman provinces, Cappadocia became an early centre of Christian settlement. The region's relative remoteness from major administrative centres, combined with pre-existing underground infrastructure, made it attractive to communities whose religious practices periodically brought them into tension with imperial authorities. The landscape itself seemed to invite spiritual retreat. The strange geological formations of the surface, the fairy chimneys and eroded pillars standing like sentinels across the valleys, the silence of the underground passages, the separation from the visible world, all resonated with an emerging Christian theology that valued withdrawal, contemplation, and the transformation of suffering into spiritual practice. Purpose-built church spaces required specific liturgical planning, baptismal fonts, altars, gathering areas for congregational worship, demanding significant architectural modification. The cruciform plan of the deepest church, with arms that appear oriented to the cardinal directions, required deliberate planning and substantial excavation to create a space whose architectural form expressed theological meaning. The cross plan embodying the central symbol of Christian faith, carved permanently into living rock. Then came the period that demanded Derinkuyu's deepest expansion. The 536 CE volcanic winter, triggered by a massive eruption that injected aerosols into the stratosphere, initiated the late antique Little Ice Age lasting from 536 to approximately 660 CE. Agricultural productivity dropped across the northern hemisphere, the Byzantine Empire weakened, and the Arab-Byzantine wars spanning the 7th through 10th centuries created exactly the conditions under which a permanent large-scale underground refuge system became most urgently necessary. The Byzantine frontier in Cappadocia was not a fixed line, but a zone of chronic insecurity. Arab raids, known in Arabic sources as Sawarif, were seasonal military operations typically conducted during summer months when roads were passable and agricultural targets were most vulnerable. Crops standing golden in fields, livestock grazing on open pasture, granaries filled with the year's harvest. The Arabic term itself, derived from the word for summer, reflects how deeply embedded this seasonal rhythm had become in the cultures on both sides of the frontier. For the communities of central Anatolia, summer was simultaneously the season of greatest agricultural productivity and greatest peril, a convergence that shaped everything about how they organised their lives in their underground spaces. The raids followed predictable geographical corridors through the Cilician gates and other mountain passes, but once through the choke points, the open plateau gave raiders freedom of movement across vast distances. Warning systems existed, including signal fires transmitted from frontier outposts to Constantinople across a chain of hilltop beacons spanning hundreds of kilometres, but the speed of mounted raiders often exceeded the capacity of local populations to organise conventional defence. The communities of inland Cappadocia could receive warning that danger was coming. What they could not do, without walls or garrisons, was stand in its path. Byzantine military strategy evolved to accommodate the reality that the frontier zone could not be permanently held. The thematic system, a military administrative reorganisation of the provinces, placed military governors in charge of frontier regions. But the primary defensive resource for civilian populations was not the Byzantine army, which could not be everywhere simultaneously. It was the underground refuge system that the population itself maintained. The rhythm of frontier warfare shaped the underground city's design requirements in specific ways. The Sawaif raids were seasonal, concentrated in summer months. This predictability allowed communities to prepare, pre-positioning food supplies underground, ensuring ventilation shafts were clear, reviewing evacuation protocols, and organising the rapid transition of populations including children, elderly, and livestock from surface settlements to subterranean refuge. The raids were rapid incursions aimed at seizing movable wealth and capturing population. A raiding force that encountered an apparently abandoned village had limited incentive to invest days searching for hidden entrances to an underground refuge it might not reach. The rational calculation for raiders was to move on to easier targets, and the rational calculation for Cappadocian communities was to make themselves just difficult enough to reach that this calculation held. This dynamic explains the calibration of Derinkuyu's specific design features. The independently sealable levels, the layered defensive corridors, the water control from below. These are not designed for withstanding a prolonged formal siege by a professional army with unlimited time, but for raising the cost of penetration above the threshold that a raiding force on a schedule would accept. The builders did not attempt the impossible task of creating an impregnable fortress. They created a system optimized for the specific threat they faced. Fast-moving raiders who would invest hours, not weeks, in attempting to reach hidden populations. Archaeological evidence from multiple Cappadocian sites shows expansion and reinforcement of underground facilities during precisely this period. New levels were added at Derinkuyu. Passages were widened or reinforced. Defensive features were refined. Ventilation and water systems expanded to accommodate larger populations sheltering for longer durations. And Christian religious installations, churches, chapels, schools, were constructed or expanded, reflecting the identity of a population that understood its circumstances in spiritual as well as practical terms. The pollen record from Nar Lake in Cappadocia, analysed in a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and described as the most highly resolved pollen record in the Eastern Mediterranean, offers independent corroboration. The data shows agricultural stability through the Plague of Justinian in 541 CE, but records a severe agricultural decline beginning in the late 7th century, coinciding precisely with the Arab conquests. It was military incursion, not plague, that drove the disruption requiring deep refuge. The cessation of intensive underground city use coincides broadly with the Byzantine reconquest of the Anatolian frontier in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, when military victories under Emperors Nicephorus II Phocas and John I Tzimiskes pushed the frontier deep into Syria, reducing the frequency and severity of raids into central Anatolia. The underground cities did not vanish from use entirely. The Mongol incursions of the 14th century and Ottoman-era persecution would call them back into service, but the peak of their defensive function had passed. What was it actually like to live underground for days or weeks at a time? The question is not romantic, it is operational. A shelter that drives its inhabitants to psychological collapse within days cannot function as a defensive system. Understanding the physiological and psychological constraints of subterranean habitation reveals the parameters within which Derinkuyu could actually have been used, and the social adaptations its inhabitants must have developed. Michel Siffre, the French geologist and speleologist, conducted foundational experiments on human underground isolation. In 1962, at 23 years old, Siffre descended into the glacial abyss of Scarasson in the Maritime Alps and remained underground for 63 days without clocks, natural light, or human contact. His only connection to the surface was a one-way telephone to report sleep and meal times. Without external time cues, his perception of time compressed dramatically. Counting to 120, a task that should take 2 minutes, required over 5 minutes. When his surface team informed him that his planned departure date had arrived, Siffre believed it was nearly a month earlier. He had lost roughly 25 days of subjective time. In 1972, sponsored by NASA, Siffre spent 6 months in Midnight Cave in southern Texas. The results were more unsettling. His sleep-wake cycle became erratic, at times extending to 36 hours of continuous wakefulness followed by 12 hours of sleep. Short-term memory deteriorated, eyesight worsened, depression deepened, compounded by equipment failures and the deterioration of reading materials from dampness. The cave dripped. The silence was not silent, but filled with the small sounds of water and stone that, without the framework of daily life to absorb them, grew immense in the mind. His only companionship was a mouse that visited his supplies. When he accidentally killed it while trying to catch it as a pet, he described the desolation as overwhelming. Siffre died in Nice on August 25, 2024 at 85, having spent decades contending with the psychological after-effects of his isolation work. The Aschoff and Weber bunker experiments at the Max Planck Institute in Andex, Germany, from the mid-1960s through the late 1980s, confirmed Siffre's core findings across over 400 subjects. Without external time cues, the human circadian clock free runs at approximately 24.5 to 25 hours, causing progressive desynchronization of sleep-wake cycles and body temperature rhythms. Crucially, however, These studies found that social cues can partially compensate for absent natural light as entrainment signals, a finding with direct implications for how ancient communities managed extended underground stays. The critical distinction is that Derinkuyu's inhabitants were not isolated experimenters. They had community, shared purpose, structured activity. They had oil lamps providing visual anchors. They had the sound of other voices, the rhythm of shared meals, the reassurance of familiar faces in unfamiliar surroundings, and their stays were temporary. The comparison with Sifra's experiments is illuminating precisely because it establishes the outer boundary of what is endurable, and thereby clarifies why Derinkuyu's design incorporated the features it did. The communal spaces, the churches, the schools, the shared cooking areas, these were not amenities. They were psychological infrastructure, as essential to the city's function as the ventilation shafts and water wells. Without them, the underground refuge would have produced the same deterioration Sifra experienced, rendering the population unable to function as a coordinated community precisely when coordination mattered most. Derinkuyu was a refuge, not a residence. Stays likely lasted days to weeks during active threats, with populations returning to surface agriculture between raids. The physiological evidence establishes hard operational limits. Vitamin D synthesis ceases entirely without ultraviolet light. Melatonin regulation becomes dysregulated within days in constant artificial illumination or darkness. Immune function shows measurable decline under conditions of chronic stress, confined quarters, and disrupted circadian rhythm. The respiratory environment posed its own challenges. Dust generated by tuff contained silica particles. Air shared with livestock carried animal dander and ammonia. Grain dust from stored supplies contributed additional particulates, and combustion products from oil lamps added carbon compounds that the ventilation system had to continuously clear. These constraints do not render underground refuge impractical. They establish that such refuge was necessarily temporary, measured in days to weeks rather than months, with the community's survival dependent on the ability to return to the surface between threats. The constant temperature of approximately 13 degrees, comfortable for short periods, represents persistent cold stress for prolonged stays without adequate clothing. Inhabitants would have relied on layered garments, animal hides, and body heat from communal sleeping. Livestock stabled on upper levels generated additional warmth, though at the cost of air quality. The metabolic heat of thousands of human bodies and dozens of animals in enclosed stone spaces would itself have raised the ambient temperature above baseline, creating a warmer but more humid microenvironment whose exact characteristics depended on population density, ventilation efficiency, and the duration of occupation. Lighting was not a luxury but an absolute necessity. The Bezirhane, linseed presses documented at both Derinkuyu and the Nevzahir site, produced lamp oil for illumination. Complete darkness induces rapid psychological deterioration in most humans, quite apart from the practical impossibility of conducting any activity without visual reference. The production and distribution of lamp oil was a critical logistical function, consuming significant quantities of linseed and generating smoke that the ventilation system needed to manage. The daily logistics during a period of sheltering were extraordinarily complex. Food supplies had to be pre-positioned and rationed. Livestock required feeding, watering, and waste management in enclosed spaces where methane and ammonia accumulation could become hazardous. Cooking generated smoke that needed evacuation. The positioning of kitchen areas near ventilation shafts in the archaeological record suggests deliberate planning for smoke management. Wine and oil presses at multiple levels indicate not luxury provisions but essential caloric and lighting resources. Sanitation for thousands of inhabitants over days or weeks demanded systematic management. No dedicated latrine chambers have been positively identified in published reports, but the sophistication evident in every other aspect of the design makes it reasonable to infer that this fundamental requirement was addressed, whether through designated waste chambers, integration with lower-level drainage, or removal during periods when surface access was temporarily safe. These hardships must be weighed against what awaited above. The raids that drove populations underground targeted agricultural infrastructure, seized livestock and portable wealth, and enslaved those unable to flee. The Mongol campaigns of the 14th century operated at even greater scale. The choice was not between comfort above and discomfort below. It was between discomfort below and devastation above. Understood in those terms, the willingness of thousands to descend into the earth requires no special explanation. Architectural evidence suggests vertical stratification by function. Upper levels housed stables and food production. Middle levels contained living quarters and educational spaces. The deepest accessible levels held sacred spaces, including the cruciform church, implying that the community assigned maximum protection to its most spiritually significant activities. The private entrances suggest deep integration between the underground city and the surface settlement, with individual families maintaining their own access points, an arrangement that facilitated rapid, simultaneous descent rather than dangerous bottlenecks at a few common entries. Community life provided what chronobiologists term social zeitgebers: shared meals, worship services, work schedules, communal activities that create temporal structure independent of natural light. These social rhythms partially compensated for absent solar cues, helping maintain psychological stability during extended underground stays. The evidence of schools, churches, and communal dining areas is consistent with a community that understood, without modern terminology, the importance of maintaining structured social life during crisis. The church spaces served a function beyond spiritual sustenance, in an environment stripped of almost every familiar sensory reference. No sky, no sunlight, no wind, no horizon, no bird song, no changing quality of light to mark the hours. The rituals of worship provided predictable, shared, emotionally resonant experiences that anchored community identity and temporal awareness. Moving from a cramped corridor into the relative spaciousness of the cruciform church, hearing voices resonate in the carved stone vault, feeling the slight warmth of gathered bodies and the flicker of lamplight on painted walls, would have constituted one of the most powerful sensory experiences available underground. A deliberate architectural offering from builders who understood that survival required tending the spirit as well as the body. The acoustic properties that NAS documented in these spaces, the long reverberation times, the way sound enveloped a congregation gathered in stone, suggest that the experience of communal worship underground was profoundly different from worship on the surface, more immersive, more encompassing, the stone itself seeming to hold and return each voice. The barrel-vaulted room on the second floor, identified as a missionary school, described as unique to Derinkuyu among all Cappadocian underground cities, suggests that the city served not merely as temporary refuge, but as a centre of religious education and cultural transmission during the Byzantine period. Teaching children underground during periods of shelter would have served dual purposes, maintaining educational continuity for the community's future and providing structured activity that helped children cope with confinement. The presence of a purpose-built school implies institutional commitment to education that transcended immediate survival, a community that thought in generational terms even during acute crisis. The social organisation required to operate this system may have been more impressive than the physical engineering. Who enters first during evacuation? How is space allocated? Who controls food and water distribution? How are the sick cared for? How is intelligence about surface conditions gathered and transmitted? Each question required answers understood and accepted by the entire community before the emergency arose, because there would be no time for deliberation once the alarm was raised. The answers must have been embedded in social practice, rehearsed through the repetition of actual emergencies across generations. A community that had descended underground dozens of times across its collective memory would develop protocols as reliable as any written procedure, encoded in habit and expectation rather than in text. No written records of underground governance or evacuation procedures have survived, and the reconstruction of specific social protocols remains informed speculation. But the architecture itself is evidence of the social order that produced it. The question of how surface conditions were monitored during underground stays has received little scholarly attention, but carries obvious significance. Someone had to assess when it was safe to return. This required either sending scouts through concealed exits, or maintaining observation through ventilation shafts or purpose-built vantage points. The 600 entrances, many concealed within surface homes, provided multiple potential observation and exit points distributed across the settlement footprint, reducing the risk that all could be simultaneously watched by an occupying force. The evidence of organised vertical stratification, with functional zones allocated by level, and the independently sealable floors suggesting contingency planning for partial breach. Together, these features describe not just a physical structure, but a social system, organisational protocols as carefully designed as the stone corridors themselves. encoded not in rock but in shared knowledge and practiced routine. No other known structure combines Derinkuyu's depth, capacity, self-sufficiency, defensive sophistication, and network interconnection at comparable scale. But comparison with underground architecture worldwide illuminates what makes it distinctive, and what it shares with a broader human tradition of subterranean adaptation. Malta's Halsaflieni Hippogeum, dating from approximately 4000 to 2500 BCE, is substantially older but functionally different. Occupying roughly 500 square metres, it served as a necropolis rather than a habitation for the living. Its carved chambers demonstrate sophisticated underground construction thousands of years before Derinkuyu, but scale and purpose differ entirely. The Hippogeum's acoustic properties, including a so-called oracle chamber that amplifies low-frequency sound, offer an intriguing parallel to Naz's acoustic research at Derinkuyu, suggesting that the relationship between underground architecture and sound has drawn human attention across diverse cultures and periods. The Cu Chi tunnels in Vietnam represent perhaps the closest functional analogue, stretching 200 to 250 kilometres during the Vietnam War. Their purpose parallels Derinkuyu's defensive logic, that of making the cost of clearing the network exceed the benefit, but their maximum depth reaches only 8 to 12 metres, the majority at 3 to 6 metres, and they were designed for combatants rather than civilian populations, including women, children, elderly, and livestock. The Suchi system also had a vastly shorter operational lifespan, decades rather than millennia, and was built under centralised military direction rather than through organic community development. The contrast in organisational models is itself revealing. Cu Chi demonstrates what coordinated command can achieve rapidly under wartime urgency, while Derinkuyu demonstrates what decentralised community effort can achieve across generations of sustained pressure. The experience of specialised tunnel units at Cu Chi, small soldiers armed with pistols and flashlights, who entered tunnels individually, illuminates the fundamental challenge that underground defence systems pose regardless of era. Narrow passages neutralise numerical superiority. The parallel is instructive not because the contexts are equivalent, they manifestly are not, but because the underlying dynamics of underground defence remain consistent across cultures and centuries. China's Yaodong cave dwellings present the most instructive scale comparison. At their peak, these homes carved into the lowest plateau of north-central China housed an estimated 30 to 40 million people, dwarfing Derinkuyu's population by orders of magnitude. The Loess, like Cappadocian tuff, is soft enough to carve but stable enough to inhabit, a geological parallel that produced an architectural parallel across thousands of kilometres and without documented cultural contact. However, Yaodong dwellings are individual family homes without integrated defensive systems, shared infrastructure, or communal organisation. The comparison highlights what is truly distinctive about Derinkuyu, not underground habitation per se, which multiple cultures achieved independently, but the integration of habitation, defence, governance and communal infrastructure into a single interconnected system. The Erdstall tunnels of Central Europe, found across Germany, Austria and elsewhere, represent another tradition of underground passage construction whose purpose remains debated. Typically narrow, low, and rarely exceeding 50 metres in length, they have been interpreted variously as refuges, ritual spaces, and storage facilities. Their existence across a broad geography suggests that the impulse to create underground passages is not unique to Cappadocia, and the medieval European communities that built them face their own cycles of insecurity, suggesting that the relationship between chronic threat and underground construction may be a more general pattern than the Cappadocian case alone would indicate. The troglodyte settlements of Tunisia and Libya, carved into soft rock in desert environments, share structural similarities with Cappadocian underground architecture despite the absence of documented cultural contact. The Berber communities of Matmeta in southern Tunisia carved pit dwellings into soft sandstone and limestone, creating underground courtyards surrounded by rooms on multiple levels, courtyards open to the sky above but entirely below the surface of the surrounding desert, invisible to anyone more than a few metres away. Like Cappadocian tuff, the local rock was soft enough to carve but stable enough to inhabit. Like Derinkuyu, the underground spaces provided climate regulation, critical in the Saharan environment where surface temperatures can exceed 50 degrees Celsius. The independent development of structurally similar underground architecture in geologically similar but culturally unconnected regions suggests a convergent solution that human populations arrive at independently when conditions align. The geological invitation is the same: soft rock, extreme climate, and the practical intelligence to recognize what the Earth itself offers. The Persian Qanat system offers a different kind of parallel, not in purpose, but in technique. Qanats are underground water channels, some extending tens of kilometers, that use gravity to transport groundwater from highland aquifers to lowland settlements. The engineering skills required, precise gradient calculation, vertical shaft construction for access and ventilation, long-distance underground alignment, overlap substantially with the skills displayed at Derinkuyu. The Qanat builders developed sophisticated methods for maintaining directional accuracy underground across distances that would challenge modern surveyors, including the use of oil lamps and plumb lines to establish sight lines through vertical shafts. Their ability to maintain a consistent downward gradient across kilometers of underground distance, with tolerances narrow enough to keep water flowing without erosion, represents one of the ancient world's most impressive feats of practical engineering, a tradition of precision underground work that spread across the entire Near East and eventually into North Africa and Iberia. Cappadocia fell under Achaemenid Persian control in the 6th century BCE, raising the possibility that Qanat engineering knowledge influenced the development of Derinkuyu's water systems. The Achaemenid administration was known for spreading Persian engineering techniques throughout its provinces, and the deep well shafts of Derinkuyu bear structural resemblance to Qanat access shafts, though no direct evidence of such transfer has been established. The parallel remains suggestive rather than demonstrated, but it positions Derinkuyu within a broader Near Eastern tradition of sophisticated subterranean engineering rather than treating it as an isolated phenomenon. Kubapedia in South Australia provides the closest modern analogue for voluntary underground habitation. Approximately 1,500 residents of this opal mining town live in underground homes carved from sandstone, driven beneath the surface by temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. The constant underground temperature of 23 to 25 degrees provides natural climate control, and the homes are by all accounts comfortable. Some include underground swimming pools, churches, and a hotel. But Kubapedia's homes are modest individual residences without defensive architecture, communal infrastructure, or historical depth. The comparison underscores how rare Derinkuyu's combination of features truly is. Not merely habitation underground, but an entire society organised to function there under duress. Within Cappadocia itself, the variation among underground cities is revealing. Kaymakli, connected to Derinkuyu by the partially collapsed 8 to 9 kilometre tunnel, spreads wider but shallower, reaching approximately 20 metres. Its layout emphasises horizontal sprawl over vertical depth, possibly reflecting a different defensive calculus or geological profile. Ozkonak features unique elements not found at Derinkuyu, including interlevel communication pipes and channels designed to pour heated liquids onto those attempting entry. Specialised solutions suggesting that different cities develop distinct defensive adaptations to local conditions and threat assessments. The communication pipes at Ozkonak are particularly significant because they indicate awareness that coordination between levels during active shelter required purpose-built acoustic channels, a deliberate engineering response to a recognised operational need. The Assyrian tin mines discovered in Kayseri province add a commercial dimension to the regional underground tradition, suggesting that the technical skills and organisational capacity required for mining may have provided the foundation on which defensive cities were later built, though this developmental sequence remains hypothetical without systematic dating evidence linking mine and city construction chronologically. This diversity within a shared tradition, the same geological opportunity adapted for the same defensive purpose, but with distinctive local variations, provides rich comparative material for understanding how ancient communities applied general principles to specific circumstances. Derinkuyu's true distinction lies not in any single metric, but in the integration of multiple systems into a coherent, self-sustaining urban environment at depth, used continuously for approximately 2,700 years. The dating problem surrounding Derinkuyu is not a failure of investigation, but a fundamental limitation of the physical evidence. As one research summary puts it with disarming simplicity, you cannot date a hole in rock. The volcanic tuff is Miocene era, approximately 10 million years old. Dating the stone is meaningless for determining when it was carved. Traditional methods, radiocarbon dating, thermoluminescence, stratigraphic analysis, cannot be applied to carved tunnels in volcanic rock in the way they can be applied to habitation layers in an open archaeological site. Only artifacts found within the spaces can be dated, and each successive civilization that used Derinkuyu replaced the material culture of its predecessors, creating a palimpsest of occupation that obscures earlier phases. The underground environment preserved the physical spaces, while the human practice of clearing and reusing them eliminated the stratigraphic record that would normally accumulate. The city's remarkable state of preservation is paradoxically an obstacle to understanding its chronology. What is firmly established is multi-phase construction. Toolmark analysis reveals the shift from stone implements to metal tools at different depths, providing a relative chronology without absolute dates. Based on stone tool marks at the deepest levels, the first two floors could predate the Iron Age, though this inference rests on the assumption that stone tools were replaced by metal tools in straightforward chronological sequence, which some scholars have questioned. Christian features, a cruciform church measuring approximately 10 by 25 by 3.5 metres on the deepest accessible level, a barrel-vaulted missionary school on the second floor, chapels with Greek inscriptions, clearly date to the Byzantine period or later. Christianity was a later overlay on an existing structure, not a motivating cause of its construction. The commonly cited statistics require careful qualification. The 18 levels appearing in virtually every popular account remain unverified by systematic investigation. Only 8 have been confirmed through direct archaeological examination. Estimates of total depth range from 11 to 18 levels, with 18 representing a popular upper bound amplified through media repetition rather than documented confirmation. The often cited capacity of 20,000 people is an estimate without published methodology. Scholarly estimates range from 3,000 to 30,000, depending on assumptions about space utilization, duration of stay, and definition of habitable area. This dating void has consequences beyond academic inconvenience. The absence of precise dates creates an information vacuum that pseudo-archaeological theories eagerly fill. Graham Hancock's suggestion of Ice Age origins in Ancient Apocalypse relies on precisely this kind of interpretive gap, using what archaeologist Carl Fegans characterized as a method of dating based on speculation rather than evidence. The reasoning is superficially appealing. If we cannot prove exactly when construction began, any date is theoretically possible. But the absence of a precise date does not make all dates equally plausible. The defensive architecture, artifact typology, historical records, and expert consensus all converge on an Iron Age origin at earliest, with major Byzantine-era expansion. The actual achievement at Derinkuyu is more worthy of attention than any pseudo-archaeological alternative precisely because it is real, because it is human, and because it required not one burst of genius but sustained, multi-generational practical intelligence spanning nearly 3,000 years. Responsible dating proceeds from convergent evidence, toolmark analysis providing relative chronology, artifact typology, establishing cultural associations, historical records documenting use periods, architectural features indicating function and cultural context. None of these lines of evidence alone would be sufficient. Together, they create a web of mutually reinforcing constraints that narrows the plausible date range to specific periods. The difference between responsible archaeology and its pseudo-counterpart is not merely methodological, but epistemological. Responsible archaeology asks what the evidence supports. Pseudo-archaeology asks what the evidence fails to exclude, a standard that could justify virtually any claim about virtually any site. Early Christian theology associated caves and underground spaces with burial, resurrection, and spiritual transformation. The catacombs of Rome served simultaneously as burial sites and worship spaces during persecution, creating associations between underground space and sacred space that likely influenced how Cappadocian Christians understood their own retreats. The decision to place the largest church at the deepest accessible level may reflect deliberate symbolic choice: maximum depth, maximum protection, maximum separation from the world of danger above. The Cappadocian Church Fathers, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, shaped Christian theology from this region in the 4th century CE. Their emphasis on asceticism, community, and spiritual resilience resonated with the lived experience of communities that periodically retreated underground to survive. the Turkish Department of Culture officially opened 8 levels to partial public access. Perhaps 50% of the known complex has been partially surveyed. The rest lies beneath a modern town, unexcavated, unmapped, its condition unknown. The methodology gaps are specific and significant. No comprehensive 3-dimensional survey using LiDAR scanning or photogrammetry has been published. Such a survey would establish precise spatial relationships between chambers, corridors and ventilation shafts, enabling computational analysis of airflow patterns, structural load distribution, and construction sequencing currently impossible. The technology has been successfully applied at sites worldwide. Its application at Derinkuyu would transform the site from a partially understood series of individual spaces into a fully mapped data set amenable to comprehensive analysis. No published quantitative airflow studies exist. The ventilation system is repeatedly described as sophisticated and effective, but no study has measured actual air velocities, temperature differentials, carbon dioxide concentrations, or oxygen levels at different depths under varying external conditions. Such measurements would determine the system's actual capacity to support specific population numbers for specific durations, replacing current estimates with engineering-based calculations. No published hydrological analysis of the water system has been conducted. How many litres per day could the well system deliver? What was the sustainable draw rate given the water table's recharge capacity? How would water quality change during extended occupation? These questions are answerable through modern methods, and their answers would establish concrete operational parameters for the city's defensive function. Optically stimulated luminescence remains the most promising unexplored dating technique. OCEL measures the time elapsed since mineral grains were last exposed to light, which in the context of underground excavation would correspond to the moment of carving when the stone was first broken open and its constituent minerals briefly saw daylight or lamplight before being sealed again in darkness. The principle is elegant. Certain minerals, particularly quartz, accumulate trapped electrons from background radiation over time, and exposure to light resets this accumulation to zero. By measuring the accumulated charge, researchers can determine how long the mineral has been in darkness, effectively dating the moment of excavation itself. If sediment deposits within the carved spaces contain quartz grains exposed during construction and then sealed in darkness, OSL could provide the first absolute dates for construction phases, resolving the fundamental chronological problem that has constrained all scholarship on the site. The practical challenges at Derinkuyu are significant. Identifying undisturbed sediment in a site continuously used for millennia requires careful field methodology, but the potential reward justifies investigation. The Idan and Uluse monitoring program, collecting environmental data since 1996, provides the scientific foundation for conservation planning. But the baseline against which changes should be measured, the conditions that prevailed during centuries of active use, remains unknown. The city was likely drier during habitation, when thousands of oil lamps generated heat and the ventilation system operated at full capacity. Current conditions with reduced airflow and no internal heat generation may represent a deviation from the historical norm. Tourism introduces moisture, carbon dioxide, and physical wear that accelerate deterioration. Each visitor contributes a small increment of warmth and humidity to an environment that maintained its equilibrium for centuries through the absence of large-scale human activity. Multiplied across thousands of visitors per year, these small increments produce measurable environmental change, raising humidity, altering temperature gradients, and potentially disrupting the very airflow patterns that have kept the stone dry and stable. Water infiltration from modern plumbing and drainage compounds are the challenge. Conservation must balance public access with preservation, a task without simple resolution, made more complex by the economic dependence of the modern town on the tourism that the underground city attracts. In 1963, a local resident renovating his basement broke through a wall and found a tunnel descending into darkness. That tunnel led to chambers, the chambers to corridors, the corridors to an entire civilization carved from stone. The town's name itself, Derinkuyu, meaning deep well in Turkish, had preserved in plain language the memory of what lay below, though the people who used the name had long since lost its fuller significance. For 40 years, the Turkish residents had used the ventilation shafts as wells, drawing water through passages that plunged past rooms and chapels they never knew existed. They lowered their buckets through engineering they could not see, hauled water past carved churches whose frescoes had faded in the perpetual dark, and returned to the surface with no knowledge of the world their wells traversed. The water came up cold and clean, and that was all they needed to know. The forgetting was not gradual. The Greco-Turkish population exchange of 1923 following the Treaty of Lausanne forcibly relocated the Greek Orthodox communities who had maintained continuous knowledge of the underground cities for millennia. Families who had descended into these corridors during every crisis within living memory, who had taught their children the routes and the protocols, who carried in their bodies the muscle memory of navigating passages in near darkness, were moved to a country where no such underground world existed. The incoming populations had no inherited knowledge of the systems, no cultural memory of their purpose. An entire underground city was separated from living memory by 40 years and a single political event. The exchange itself, which affected approximately 1.5 million Greeks from Turkey and 500,000 Muslims from Greece, was one of the largest forced population transfers of the 20th century. Its consequences for archaeological knowledge in Cappadocia were incidental to its political purpose, but no less thorough for being unintended. The Cappadocian Greeks carried their knowledge to Greece. Dawkins' documentation from 1909 to 1911 preserves accounts of communities who used the underground spaces as living landscape, who knew which entrances led where, who maintained passages and ventilation shafts, who organised the transition from surface to underground life when danger materialised. This accumulated practical knowledge, refined across 100 generations, was effectively lost to the site itself in 1923. The rupture in cultural transmission illustrates a broader principle about how knowledge of complex systems is maintained and how swiftly it can vanish. The underground cities were not documented in any known written manual or architectural archive. Their operation depended entirely on embodied, community-held knowledge, the kind of knowledge that exists in practice rather than in text. Every family knew its own entrance route. Experienced community members knew the layout of shared spaces, the location of water sources, the protocols for ceiling levels and managing evacuation. This knowledge constituted a kind of distributed understanding for the underground city, held collectively and transmitted through direct experience rather than formal instruction. The population exchange did not merely move people. It separated the knowledge from the structure, leaving behind a physical form that had lost its interpretive context entirely. The Snopes investigation of the rediscovery story rated the core claim that a local resident found the tunnels during a basement renovation in 1963 as true. The BBC's account includes a version involving chickens disappearing through a gap in a wall, though this particular detail appears to be a local embellishment. What is certain is that the discovery opened a chapter of investigation that continues today, each year revealing more of a subterranean world that the people living directly above it had used as nothing more than an unusually deep water source. But the sites themselves keep appearing. The 2014 discovery beneath Nevşehir's hilltop castle reframes the entire discussion. Construction workers demolishing housing for an urban renewal project uncovered a network of rooms and tunnels. Geophysicists from Nevşehir University conducted initial surveys suggesting the site could extend approximately 113 metres deep and cover roughly 460,000 square metres, potentially one-third larger than Derinkuyu. Nevşehir Museum Director Murat Gülyaz cautioned that exact dimensions remained uncertain, but noted the site's location, defences, and proximity to water supply suggested a very large area. The planned housing development was relocated, and archaeological investigation commenced. The site revealed living spaces, kitchens, wineries, chapels, staircases, and bezirhane, features likely in use from the Byzantine era through the Ottoman conquest. If confirmed at its projected scale, the Nevşehir discovery suggests that Derinkuyu, long treated as the exemplary underground city, may not even have been the largest in its own region, a possibility that recalibrates assumptions about the scope of underground construction throughout Cappadocia. A 3-mile underground city was discovered in Kalis Township in 2019, when municipal workers investigated flooding. The Obruk Cave Research Group's inventory project in Kayseri province has documented 33 underground cities, 47 Byzantine churches, and 10 Assyrian tin mines, continuing to expand the known scale of the phenomenon. Cappadocia contains an estimated 200 or more underground cities, at least 40 with 3 or more levels, many connected by kilometres-long tunnels. The confirmed tunnel between Derinkuyu and Kaymakli, extending 8 to 9 kilometres, though now partially collapsed, demonstrates engineering capability and organisational coordination that extended beyond individual cities. Building such a tunnel required carving through kilometres of rock while maintaining alignment, ensuring ventilation, and coordinating construction from both ends. The margin for error in aligning 2 tunnels driven from opposite directions across 9 kilometres, using only pre-modern surveying techniques, would have been extraordinarily narrow. The fact that they met suggests either remarkable surveying skill or an incremental approach in which alignment was checked and corrected at intervals, possibly through intermediate vertical shafts sunk from the surface to verify position. The existence of this tunnel implies inter-community planning that treated the underground network as a regional system rather than a collection of isolated refugees. A network of connected cities would have offered capabilities exceeding those of any individual site. Populations could potentially have relocated between cities underground, distributing themselves to reduce pressure on any single site's resources. Intelligence about surface conditions could have been transmitted through the tunnel system. This reconstruction remains speculative, but even one confirmed intercity tunnel implies a scale of regional coordination that invites further investigation. The implications extend into questions of regional governance that the archaeological record has not yet addressed. Who authorised the construction of a tunnel spanning nearly 9 kilometres between 2 separate communities? How was the labour organised and shared? How were 2 construction teams coordinated to meet in the middle? The engineering challenges alone suggest a level of inter-community cooperation that goes well beyond the informal, family-based expansion model that characterised individual city growth. If the Nevşehir site is confirmed at its projected dimensions, the entire framework for understanding Cappadocian underground architecture may require revision. A substantially larger site could provide data that challenges or refines current understanding in ways impossible to predict before excavation is complete. The Nevşehir site, still largely unexcavated, also offers a rare opportunity to study underground preservation conditions without decades of tourist access, potentially providing baseline data to inform conservation strategies at other sites where tourism has already altered the microclimate. The full picture, total extent, organisational principles, construction chronology, social implications, remains a work in progress. Decades from completion, perhaps longer. The story of Derinkuyu is not in the end a story about fear, though fear was the catalyst. It is a story about response, about the difference between a threat that paralyses and a threat that produces sustained, practical, multi-generational action. The populations of central Anatolia faced the same fundamental problem across 3,000 years. They lived on land that armies wanted to cross, in a region that empires wanted to control, with no natural terrain offering conventional protection. Their response was not flight, not submission. Their response was to build, slowly and steadily, generation by generation, a system of invisible refuges that rendered their exposure something an adversary simply could not exploit. The Hittites or their contemporaries may have carved the first simple chambers, an inference from tool-mark evidence, not firm dating. The Phrygians likely expanded them with monumental stoneworking skills honed on the cliff facades of Midas city. Romans and early Christians added new functions and sacred spaces. Byzantines deepened and fortified the complex during centuries of frontier insecurity. Each generation inherited what the last had built and improved upon it. No single culture could have produced Derinkuyu as it exists. The city represents cumulative intelligence layered across millennia, each generation adding rooms, deepening passages, refining what it found, adapting existing infrastructure to change conditions. The social achievement deserves equal recognition. This city was not built by a state deploying conscripted labour for a ruler's glory. It was built by communities protecting themselves, incrementally, over generations, with no central authority directing the work and no monumental ambition beyond survival. The expansion followed organic processes, families extending their own underground space in coordination with neighbours, property divided among heirs. The cumulative result was extraordinary complexity that emerged without centralised direction, an outcome with parallels in other self-organising systems. Medieval European towns, the canal networks of the Netherlands, the terrace agriculture of Southeast Asia, all exhibit functional structures arising from the interaction of many agents following shared principles without central planning. In each case, the accumulated result far exceeds what any individual participant could have designed, yet it emerges from a coherent internal logic that gives the whole system a kind of organic intelligence. Derinkuyu may represent one of the most remarkable examples of such emergent complexity in the archaeological record, distinguished by the additional constraint that its development occurred largely out of sight, in a medium that preserved every decision permanently in stone. The underground churches of Goreme, part of the same geological and cultural landscape, preserve frescoes of remarkable artistic quality dating from the pre-iconoclastic period through the later Byzantine era. These demonstrate that underground spaces were not merely functional shelters, but environments where creative and spiritual life flourished, where artists painted in lamplight on stone walls, creating images that would remain in darkness for centuries, seen only by communities who descended into the earth to pray. The pigments were ground and mixed underground from locally available minerals, iron oxide for reds, copper compounds for greens, lapis lazuli or its substitutes for the rare, precious blues that illuminated the robes of saints. The compositions were planned for walls that would never receive natural light, their proportions calibrated to be read by the warm, unsteady glow of oil lamps that would have made the figures seem almost to breathe. The saints and biblical scenes were painted by artists working in conditions of physical confinement and intermittent danger, and yet the work shows no diminishment of care or ambition. The impulse to create beauty underground in spaces that might serve as refuge from danger speaks to something fundamental about the communities that built and used these places. They were not merely surviving, they were insisting on the continuation of culture itself, even in extremity. And then, in 1923, the chain broke. The people who had built and maintained the city across 100 generations were forced from the land. They could not take their underground city with them. They took their knowledge, their memories, their identity. The city fell silent, its passages dark, its ventilation shafts reduced to wells serving a population that did not know what lay below their feet. For 40 years, an underground world waited in darkness, its purpose forgotten, its builders scattered across the Aegean. The forgetting is as instructive as the construction. Stone endures, knowledge does not without the continuous chain of human transmission that carries it forward. The underground cities of Cappadocia survived earthquakes, incursions, and the passage of millennia. They did not survive the severance of the human chain that understood them. What was lost in 1923 was not the physical city, but the living tradition that gave it meaning. The knowledge of which passages led where, the protocols for emergency descent, the distribution of responsibilities during underground stays, the shared understanding that transformed a labyrinth of stone corridors into a functioning community. All of this vanished in a single political act, more thoroughly than any earthquake could have accomplished. A structure engineered to outlast centuries of seismic activity was rendered incomprehensible in a single generation by the removal of the people who understood it. The contrast between the permanence of the stone and the fragility of the knowledge it required is perhaps the most sobering lesson Derinkuyu offers, a reminder that the most durable architecture is only as legible as the community that reads it. Approximately 90% of Derinkuyu remains beneath the modern town, unexcavated. The deepest chambers remain unvisited by archaeologists. The full extent of the tunnels remains unmapped. No advanced dating techniques have been applied. No comprehensive airflow study has been completed. New cities continue to emerge through construction projects, flood investigations, and survey work, each discovery expanding what appears to be the largest underground refuge network ever constructed by human civilization. What 52 major shafts and tens of thousands of smaller passages accomplished, sustaining breathable air across a three-dimensional network of hundreds of interconnected spaces at varying depths, entirely through passive physics, may represent the most sophisticated air management system constructed before the Industrial Age. And we do not yet have the data to fully characterize its performance. No computational fluid dynamics model has been published. No one has measured whether it could actually support the population numbers claimed in popular accounts. This is not a failure of modern science, but an invitation to apply it, What remains, finally, is what the stone holds and what it cannot tell us. The rooms are there, the corridors, the doors still seated in their grooves. The shafts still draw air, the wells still reach the water table, but the voices that filled these spaces, the hands that knew every turning, the children who grew up practicing the descent and who carried that knowledge into adulthood to teach their own children, all of that lives now only in the faintest traces. A worn groove in the floor where 1,000 feet found the same path in darkness. A smoke-darkened ceiling above a kitchen that fed generations. The faded pigment of a saint's face painted by lamplight for an audience that would never see the sun while they prayed. Each trace is the residue of a life lived in response to circumstances that demanded ingenuity, patience, and an extraordinary faith in the future. The conviction that what one generation began, the next would continue, and the next would refine, and that the accumulated work of all of them together would be enough. Beneath the quiet streets of a Turkish town, the work of 100 generations waits in the stone, preserved in the medium it was carved from, offering testimony to anyone willing to descend and listen.